where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives of George Samueli. It is now 9:07 p.m. in the Central European city of Budapest. And for once, I don't really have any complaint to make about the season or the weather or anything like that. I mean, the spring has arrived. The sun is out, and the days are noticeably longer. And so the usual forecast that things are really grim and bleak and whatever that I initially introduced these live stream. I can't do it now, but I will, no doubt, as we approach the 21st of June and the moment that the days start getting shorter. And that's always the bleakest moment of the year, when we know that all the good times are over and we're heading towards the darkness and grimness of winter. But for the time being, I'm going to hold off on that. But anyway, thank you so much for joining me. And obviously, there's a few things to discuss. So first, I want to talk about the Canadian election and this rapturous reception that Mark Carney's victory has received from much of the media. So here is this person who is a central banker. He was the head of the Canadian National Bank, and then he was the head of the Bank of England. And so that's what he does. He's a banker. He used to be at Goldman Sachs first, and then he became a central banker. But now we're living in this age in which the heroes of the hour are central bankers. So we talked last week about the American hero, which was Jerome Powell, who is speaking truth to power because he's standing up for Trump. So apparently, Fed independence is the sort of the new rebellion. This is the new assertion of freedom, the new assertion of independence from government. So apparently that's the new cause of liberty, which is the independence of the Fed, which is really quite extraordinary because no one else had ever argued any such nonsense, because most people would assume that economic policy should be dictated by democratically accountable political leaders. Now, a central banker is not only has not been elected to anything. A central banker, apparently, his conditions for his work is that he is not to listen at all, not to pay any attention whatsoever to what elected political leaders tell him. He's apparently going to pursue his policies entirely based on the data, whatever the data mean. But apparently it's all about the economic data. And so whatever politicians say, he's not going to do it. He'll be only concerned with the economic data. This is a very interesting development in modern democracies, that apparently we're going to allow central bankers to decide economic policy. Here we are. We were naive in believing that somehow that it's up to politicians, people who are accountable to voters, to shape economic policy. I mean, why even have elections if all economic policy is to be decided by the central bank? Now, I'm not saying that we should have politicians manning the printing presses and churning out money. It's not necessarily desirable. However, neither should it be done by the central bankers. And the notion that somehow a central banker will be deciding economic policy according to some experts. We don't even know who these experts are. Experts sitting in a room somewhere looking over data. We don't even know what the data are, and that's all there is to it. And there's to be no input there at all. That's clearly not really acceptable, and no one had ever believed this to be acceptable. I mean, first of all, the record of the central banks is not exactly sterling. They missed the subprime mortgage fiasco, even though there were clear signs among the economic data that something bad was happening in the housing market, that there was an artificial housing boom that is being generated, and that this is going to cause an economic crisis, as all fake booms always do. And yet the Fed missed it. Plenty of people knew about these subprime mortgages and the problems that the subprime mortgages would cause, and yet the Fed missed it. And strangely enough, the Fed never really got the blame for it. But now, apparently, so that we got this Jerome Powell is the hero of the hour, but now Mark Carney is the hero. This is apparently a great victory for liberalism. Liberals have now got this big win under their belt. They've punched Donald Trump in the nose. Well, the problem there is that clearly, Canada isn't doing particularly well, and Carney is one has to assume is not going to be as ineffectual and as politically correct and woke as his predecessor Trudeau, Justin Trudeau was. But the truth is that the failure here is the failure of Pierre Poilievre, who is the conservative leader, because Pierre Poilievre really ran essentially as an orthodox conservative. He was mouthing the familiar Reagan, Thatcher slogans, tax cuts, deregulation, and of course, Ukraine. Everything for Ukraine, plus the familiar I love Israel. Now, that's the sort of the line from the basically establishment conservatism as expressed in the basic conservative media outlets, National Review, Wall Street Journal, editorial page, and so on. And that's the campaign that Pierre Poilievre ran. And anybody could have told him that doesn't get you anywhere. That is not sufficient to win you elections. A kind of traditional conservatism does not win you elections. And we saw obviously the implosion of the Conservatives in the United Kingdom, and we saw how poorly the Conservatives fared in Germany. Yes, Friedrich Merz eked out a very unimpressive victory, and he will be forced to have a coalition government with the equally, maybe a little bit more so, unpopular party of the Social Democrats. So these two extremely unpopular political parties will be forming a coalition in Germany. And the slogan of this new government, which will be taking power imminently, is everything must continue just as it always has. Orthodoxy, status quo. We must do everything that we have been doing in the recent past. It's failed, and it's bound to fail. But we don't actually have any better ideas So we'll just continue doing what we've always been doing, because the most important thing is we keep out the anti-establishment parties like the Alternative for Deutschland, and above all, that we stand up to Donald Trump. Now, Pierre Poilievre kind of did something very similar in Canada. He decided to run an orthodox conservative campaign plus anti-Trump. Now, he may well have thought that that's the way to win in Canada, is to be anti-Trump. It's hard to say whether that's necessarily the case, but clearly the only way that parties of the right can win these days is by embracing some kind of some variation on populist nationalism. That's the only way you can do it. You cannot go back to the Reagan Thatcher playbook. But that's what Poilievre did. So he himself lost his constituency, though. But I'm not sure whether he's going to continue as leader, because he said, "Well, we did pretty well. I mean, we clearly increased our vote, and we ended up not that far behind Canada's Liberals, but nonetheless, he lost, and he had." The Conservatives had been ahead by some 25 points at the start of the year. Now, admittedly, that was they were thinking that they would be running against Justin, but nonetheless, he lost. They were expecting to win, and they didn't. But the most important thing is that you have to embrace this kind of the nationalist populism for a conservative. Tax cuts, deregulation, and somehow a commitment to free trade, globalism, and neoliberalism, and interventionist foreign policy, Ukraine, and we must do whatever for Israel. That simply doesn't work. It may, even when you look back on the Reagan era. I mean, it was a very peculiar that time of the late 1970s, because marginal tax rates then were very high, and what was happening was, because of inflation, people who were getting through inflation, they were getting pushed into this high tax brackets, and once they got pushed into the higher tax brackets, they got walloped. And so then Reagan ended that and drastically reduced marginal tax rates, and that kind of dealt with that taxation policy. Ever since then, conservatives who have been running on this policy of tax cuts haven't really seen any much results from that, because that was just that one time that it worked. But it hasn't worked since. And again, there's only the justification for tax cuts if tax rates are exorbitantly high, which in the United States they're not, or if there's a recession, and the way to get out of the recession is to cut taxes in order to get people to spend their money. That there's no reason that there's no recession. So because there's no particular need for tax cuts, this has been turned into a fool's gold for conservatives for generations, still thinking that the Ronald Reagan magic formula will work for them. So now, what I think was just interesting, the reason I brought up the case of Mark Carney, is that already the media are running with this theme of the anti-Trump, that somehow liberals have fought back that they'd been on the back foot, getting walloped by Trump for all this for months now, and now finally they've got the new hero, Mark Carney, and this should serve as a as an inspiration for another liberal politician to come forward and to take on Trump. So that's why if you look through the Financial Times, you look through the Guardian, they're all extolling the virtues of Mark Carney, and they all have the same theme, which is, and I think like Timothy Garton Ash in the Guardian, I think wrote yesterday that we are all Canadians now. That somehow he's now Carney, the central banker, is the hero of the Liberals. But they needed that, of course, on MSNBC, CNN. They're running wall to wall coverage of Carney without really addressing like the issue is like, is he actually going to be able to deal with Canada's acute problems? So anyway, that's that. The other thing, of course, is that today is the 100-day anniversary of Trump's ascension to power, and it's kind of interesting to look back on this 100 days and assess what he has accomplished and what he hasn't. Now, of course, there's nothing special about the 100 days. That only came into vogue in the Roosevelt era. There's somehow there's this magic moment of 100 days. It doesn't really measure anything. You're 3 months in, and you have no idea whether the policies will succeed. There's no question that Trump has embarked on a very ambitious agenda, and the tariffs. I mean, we've talked about that before. We'll probably talk about it today. I think it's something that obviously Trump had to do. This is part of his economic policy of ending the trade deficits, ending budget deficits, and bringing the national debt under some control. And above all, to bring manufacturing industry back to the United States, and to end the sort of the trade imbalances that have clearly skewed world trade now for a long time, and particularly so since China's emergence on the scene, China's entry into the World Trade Organization. So the global trade imbalance, obviously had to be rectified, and so he's embarked on that. Then he's undertaken the immigration policy, kind of again some drastic changes on immigration, and he's obviously had successes when it comes to control of the border. So you had the sort of totally ridiculously out of control border during the Biden years, and now basically is really very sharply reduced the number of migrants going across the border, the various apprehensions of illegals at the border, and that obviously that's a major accomplishment. Now the other part of it, which was his deportations, that really hasn't been particularly successful because, of course, the courts have stepped in and are determined to thwart his policies at every step of the way, and that's going to be have to be resolved in some way by the Supreme Court, because you can't have a situation in which the courts have taken over immigration policy from the president. I mean, this is the Supreme Court has ruled that immigration policy is within the jurisdiction of the president. You can't just have district court judges simply deciding immigration, and above all, you really can't have these kind of nationwide injunctions issued by lowly judges, and yes, there's such a thing as due process rights. Everyone has a due process right, but your due process rights, if you're an illegal in the country, is quite limited. I mean, you certainly have the due process right to show that you are the person that the government claims you are. So you have to present some form of ID. But once you really can't prove that you're in the country legally, if you don't have any paperwork to show that you're in the country legally, then your due process rights pretty much end. Otherwise, it does become a you abusing the system, using opportunistic lawyers to jerk the system around, which of course is the whole purpose of these lawsuits, because they know that Trump's agenda will stand or fall on immigration. That it was. This is the policy that he ran on. It's been his signature issue since 2015, and so if he fails, then Trump's agenda fails, and so the using the courts very adroitly in order to stop Trump's policy of deportations, because of course these deportations that Trump is now trying to accomplish should be the easiest to do, because these are the criminals. So it's not so the suspected criminals or suspected terrorists. So it's not like he's trying to get people out of the country who have been here for 10 years and who have wives and children and so on, which everyone believes, well, yeah, they're illegal, they should be out of the country, but it's going to be very difficult because they have wives and children, they've built ties to their communities. How are you going to get them out without causing all sorts of painful scenes? So I thought, okay, well, that's going to be difficult, but this should be pretty easy. I mean, if you have people who are connected with some gangs or suspected terrorists or whatever, that should be pretty straightforward. This, it's like a done deal. You take them to court and then take them out of the country. But nonetheless, Trump has had difficulties with this, and so if he fails there, then I think his immigration policy fails. So that's obviously clearly where the battle lines are drawn, and where clearly the courts, and above all the Supreme Court, will have to get involved. The Supreme Court will have to just make some decision. Otherwise, every single attempt at deportation will get stuck at the district court level, and basically just go nowhere. I mean, it'll be just endless, interminable litigation just to get a few people out. And so, if you're talking about millions, which is what Trump is promised, he's going to get millions of people out. He's said he's going to get out of the country all of the people who entered the country illegally during the Biden years. So if if you can't even get these people out, then he's not going to get anyone out, and then that's essentially it's a kind of a fait accompli. You know, you basically, well, everyone who's in is in, and then, you know, once people realize that if you're in, you're in, and then no one can get you out, that's only going to encourage further immigration, and obviously the change in the national character of America, which is clearly what you know, Trump promised he would not allow. So that's clearly where his record is, I think, mixed. I mean, the tariffs thing is also at least a mixed record. I mean, it's like, because he's imposed some tariffs, but he's retreated, at least temporarily, on some tariffs. You know, and you know, he's allowed exemptions. However, one has to keep in mind that these are very early days, and so we don't know how that's all going to play out. You know, what tariffs will stay in place, which will be removed, which will be enhanced. I mean, that's obviously up for negotiation. The problem, obviously, is that and here we got the media, of course, playing their usual game, which is the playing up the polls, the poll numbers. They say, "Oh, these are really dire poll numbers." They're not really dire, but you know, obviously, any president will see his popularity decline from the dizzying heights that he enjoyed immediately after his election victory. So, but anytime you're trying to govern, and anytime you're trying to affect real change, you're going to be unpopular. I mean, that's just one of the things you got, and so therefore, that's, you know, clearly it was only to be expected that his popularity will decline. The media naturally making this the big, you know, day after day of story of the day, which is, whoa, he's, you know, Trump. Look at Trump's plunging poll numbers. But the thing about any government, serious government, anyone who wants to do something serious, knows that he's going to become unpopular. It's bound to happen. You will be unpopular. If you just want to be popular, if you just want to go by the polls, well, then you can do that. You're not going to accomplish anything, but you can absolutely enjoy popularity. You can absolutely enjoy cultivating the media. You know, you can certainly enjoy making banal, easily popular gestures. You will accomplish nothing, and in fact, you will end up being very unpopular. And so you know, that it was only understandable that Trump would start losing support. The question is, will Trump be swayed from his policies if you know, if you know, he continues to decline in the polls? I hope he doesn't, but it's possible. Trump does concern himself. I don't think he should, but he does concern himself with what the New York Times says about him, what big media say about him. So on the one hand, he's always bashing big media, and then New York Times, the failing New York Times, but he seems awfully preoccupied with it because it's, you know, yeah, the New York Times is going to trash him. I mean, that's a given. So there's really no point in preoccupying yourself with the New York Times. But he does that, and he gives interviews to big media. He gave an interview to Jeffrey Goldberg the other day. I just don't realize why on earth he's doing this for. Now, the question then is, um, will this have an effect? I don't know. Now, the one other thing is the on the foreign policy front, which of course he gets a lot of flack for. The only time he's got any praise at all on foreign policy is after he sent out that truth following his meeting with Zelensky in Rome, in which he seemed to be quite harsh about Putin. He said, "Well, maybe Putin is kind of stringing me along. Maybe he's not serious about peace. Well, then, going to have to start thinking about a secondary sanction." Of course, then a lot of excitement in the media, and then he got a lot of good media coverage, much like he got a lot of good media coverage during his first term after he bombed Syria. Suddenly, hey, that they really loved it. So here, the idea that, oh, thank God, he's going to abandon his policy of trying to improve relations with Russia. Thank God he's about to blame Russia for the war. Thank God he's about to see Ukraine as the innocent victim. Thank God he's going to identify with Ukraine. Thank God he's going to do what he's supposed to do, send whatever arms U.S. has to Ukraine, and apply harsher sanctions against Russia, and basically just continue as before. Unconditional support for Ukraine. So that was, the media got very excited by his truth that now finally maybe at last Trump has seen the light and he's ready to support Ukraine to the hilt. I don't know whether that is the case. I mean, Trump has gone from one position to another on Ukraine. I mean, obviously we've done a number of podcasts on the subject, and I think we can conclude that Trump wants to bring this war to an end. He hasn't quite figured out under what conditions. He just doesn't see this war as in any way benefiting everyone, which is completely correct. However, and despite the fact that he is exasperated by Ukraine, by Ukraine's refusal, essentially just to call it a day and say, look, this war, it makes no sense. We're getting killed here, literally, and just let's just end this. But instead of that, Ukraine and Ukraine's enablers want this war to continue. So he's had difficulties to see how he can bring it to an end. Now, we talked about these various peace proposals that have been floated around. No one has actually confirmed that any of them is genuine. But the peace proposals that were published in Reuters end of last week suggested that Trump would recognize Russian sovereignty over Crimea. He would recognize de facto Russian possession of whatever 70% of Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye. He would recognize pretty much all of Lugansk, and then he'd take NATO off the table. But that he obviously provided some sops for Ukraine, which were that Ukraine would get some kind of a security guarantee, which would involve the Europeans, not the Americans, but it would involve the Europeans. But Ukraine would continue to receive arms from maybe arms from the United States. There's no indication that he intends to end arms deliveries to Ukraine. No indication that the Europeans intend to stop deliveries of arms to Ukraine. Plus some lifting of sanctions on Russia, but only those sanctions that the United States imposed. Now, obviously, Lavrov, who gave this interview to CBS, Face the Nation over the weekend, very politely said, "Well, it's not. This is not really much of a deal because the Ukraine will continue to get arms, and if there are no restrictions on arms deliveries, no restrictions on on the size of Ukraine's armed forces, then there's nothing really much for Russia to agree to. Because if you're just going to continue to deliver arms for Ukraine, and through these security guarantees, European powers, European NATO powers, are going to start building military bases in Ukraine, deploying missiles, anti-aircraft systems, then essentially you've made Ukraine a de facto member of NATO. And then Russia can't possibly agree to that. And if Ukraine can just have an armed forces much bigger than the one they have now, then this obviously doesn't in any way, shape, or form address Russia's security concerns. And so that is a non-starter. I mean, if Ukraine was ready to agree in Istanbul on restrictions on foreign military bases in Ukraine and restrictions on the size of its armed forces, then it seems very strange for Russia to accept something in 2025 that it was actually close to getting Ukraine to agree to 3 years ago. So that's it can't happen. And in some ways, if we looked at the conditions that were spelled out by Lavrov in the not so much in the Margaret Beckett Face the Nation interview, but in the Brazilian newspaper interview, it's very much that Russia has actually stiffened its demands, because not only on the issue of NATO, the size of armed forces, no NATO presence in Ukraine, but he talked very much about the treatment of Russians, Russian speakers, Russian Orthodox Church believers. All of that would have to be on the table. Then all the entirety of the 4 oblasts would have to be free of Ukrainian military presence. So as things stand, it's hard to see how there can be much progress. What Trump last week, when I was kind of relatively optimistic, because it seemed as if Trump was moving towards meeting some of Russia's concerns, and the Russians themselves were saying, "Yeah, well, we're seeing positive signs from the Trump administration." But if that doesn't happen, then it's very hard to see what would be the point. The only circumstance and the only argument for Russia really to accept some version of this deal is if so, sorry, I just saw something. Somebody saying, "George, your notifications on local seem to me to have confusing times in them. Have you heard this from anyone else?" No, I have not heard that. That's concerning. I didn't realize that the times were confusing. Well, I have to look into that. So is a question of now the war is whether there's an incentive to bring a war to an end. Now that is very much a strong argument for bringing a war to an end, because there's no question um, that is very, very rare in history for one side to achieve a decisive, overwhelming, crushing defeat of the other. That sort of unconditional surrender a la 1945, it's very, very rare. It's just, it's never that. I mean, yes, one side seems to have um, an advantage of the other, but it's by no means it's overwhelming. The war could, in theory, continue. Um, so the question is, well, how do wars end? Well, wars end when sides decide that that the cost of continuing the fight exceed the costs of accepting the circumstances of the moment, and that's that often happens. I mean, you think about Korea or Vietnam, um, and other wars. They never really end. I think against Soviet Union and Afghanistan, they never really end with any decisive victory. It's just like, well, do we want to continue with this? Because if we continue, this is going to go on for another 3, 4, 5 years. And I've got to remember, the Americans can absolutely continue to deliver arms. The Europeans can continue to deliver arms, and they can go on doing what they've been doing. Ukrainians dying, of course, Ukraine getting destroyed, of course, but the Americans and the Europeans don't really care about that. They only care about destroying Russia. So then the question is, can Russia deliver an overwhelming, decisive defeat of Ukraine, such that essentially it'll be the terms of unconditional surrender? Kiev will say, okay, we'll give you everything that you want. Is that conceivable? Is that something that can happen? All right, let's say by the end of this year. Well, let's say give it 12 months. Can that be done within the next 12 months? I have my doubts. I haven't seen this the plan for this victory. So, and the rate of progress in Ukraine is excruciatingly slow. At some point down the road, yes, Russia wins, but what's down the road? 5 years, 10 years? That's a heavy cost to continue with this war. So that would be an argument. That would be a strong argument for accepting a peace plan that is clearly very short of Russia's demands. But the moment going by the comments of Lavrov in particularly in that interview with a Brazilian newspaper, that it doesn't look like Russia is in any mood to accept anything like Trump's plan. So the war goes on, and would that be a problem for Trump? Probably not. He will say, "Look, I did my best. I tried," and he can say, "Yeah, I did try. I mean, I tried to meet both sides." Of course, the one way that he could end it, and this is very obvious, the one way that he could end it is if he cut Ukraine off. And that obviously he's thought about, and when he started berating Zelensky in that famous Oval Office meeting, that was at the back of his mind, and in other truths that he sent out about Zelensky, that's very much at the back of his mind. Look, I can just cut you off, and then see how you fare without us. So he knows this. But I don't think he wants to do it. And I think he doesn't want to do it because I don't think he wants to be seen as the leader who basically let down our side, let down Ukraine. I think he wants to get some kind of a deal that Ukraine can sign on to, Russia can sign on to, and then the question of who won, who lost, that can be settled by others. But but given that he's not prepared to bite the bullet and abandon Ukraine, which is the one way the war could end, and he doesn't want to be seen as the one who betrayed Ukraine, the one who let Ukraine down, the one who let our side down, let the West down, and so on. He doesn't want to be seen. Then the war goes on. Um, uh, but and if the war goes on, and he doubles down on supporting Ukraine, that means he's going to send more arms to Ukraine and more money and so on. He'll enjoy a good press for that. The media will cut him some slack, and so he's not going to get any criticism. MAGA won't be happy about it, but on the other hand, MAGA will focus on other things that they quite like. I mean, they like his immigration stance. They like the fact that he's fighting the courts, and they like him going after the elite universities. So he's going to be able to say, okay, well, I haven't done that, but I've done other things that you like. I've gone after DEI and all sorts of things. I haven't, but Ukraine, I haven't delivered on. So um, I think that's probably where that goes. Where I think it's quite interesting is, would Trump decide that he's actually going to take on the courts? Because remember, I mean, the way the United States system works is you have these three co-equal branches of government. You have the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive, but they are co-equal. Now, the way it's been working out, and particularly during the Trump time, is that the senior most branch of government is the judiciary. Apparently, the judiciary has the last say on everything. So, which is very, very strange, because of the three branches of government, the judiciary is the one that isn't elected. So the legislature obviously is elected, and then you have the president, the only person in the entire country for whom the entire nation voted. So that was everyone else gets voted at the district level or at the state level or the city level, whatever. But he's the one person, the one office holder who is voted on by the entire country. So you think, well, he should have the senior most position. But in fact, the way it works is that the judges, the unelected judges, have seniority over him. They could just simply bring to an end what he's doing. Now, Trump has said that he will abide by the law, he will abide by the rulings of the courts. So he hasn't in any way challenged the courts in the way other presidents have. I mean, obviously, the way Andrew Jackson had, the way Abraham Lincoln had, the way FDR had. He hasn't done it. He said, no, we will follow the rulings of the courts. And maybe he will. But there may come a point at which he's going to say, I'm not going to follow the rulings of the courts. This is a co-equal branches of government. The courts don't have the last say on everything. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus in defiance of the Supreme Court. So Trump can go down that path. I mean, a lot of liberals are anxious, predicting that that's what he will do, and I'm sure at this stage he doesn't plan on doing so, but he could reach that point when he's after months and months, and he's saying he's just not getting anywhere because at every step the courts are thwarting him, and the U.S. Supreme Court clearly is not going to step in and rein in the lower courts. So he may decide, well, that's it. I mean, I'm not going to follow the rulings of the courts, and then see what happens. Well, what happens, of course, is that there will be attempts to impeach him, but there would be attempts to impeach him anyway. Um, once the Democrats, and I imagine that's quite likely, the Democrats win the midterms next year, then they will, as first order of business, try to impeach him. At this stage, they obviously don't have the votes to convict him in the Senate. You need the 67 votes in the Senate, and they don't have them. Republicans have a majority in the Senate. But that's a question arises: if Trump decides that he will ignore the rulings of the courts and cite as precedent Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Jackson, will he lose Republicans and say, "Well, we can't support, a president who doesn't follow the rulings of the courts"? But if the courts are so politicized, if these judges are such political animals, that they're basically trying to thwart the democratic will, then it's hard to see the argument against ignoring the courts. I mean, I think then you say, like, I don't see why I should go on following this, because they are clearly thwarting the agenda on which I ran. I mean, I ran explicitly on this agenda. I won an election on this agenda, and I'm not being allowed to enact this agenda because of unelected political hacks appointed by Obama and Biden, who basically think that they can thwart the democratic will. So that may be something that's down the road. Anyway, let's take a look at some of the comments on our locals page. So these are the people who are concerned about the dog situation, because they know that the dogs really determine policy here. I don't determine policy; it's the dogs that determine policy. And let's see if we can take a look. And so here is Marx 2023. Says, George, your Friday program was nothing more than a capitulation speech. Capitulation. I capitulated regarding the ceasefire peace agreement by the estate agent Trump, who owns this war. Under his first term, the Ukrainian army expanded faster than with Obama. I must conclude that you, George, are indeed a rootless liberal cosmopolitan. What say you? I don't understand. How did I capitulate, and why am I a rootless liberal cosmopolitan? I guess I just don't quite understand the question. I mean, all I'm doing is presenting the Trumpian plan to the extent that that is the plan. I mean, I'm going by all the newspaper report, above all by what Reuters published, and I argued that there's a basis here for some kind of a deal. It's far from anything that the Russians could accept, but it's the basis for making some progress in the negotiations. If Trump were determined to go down this path, if Trump, however, said, "Well, I've made this step, but now I'm going to keep Ukraine happy, and then I'm going to do something to the Russians, and then I'm going to go back and try to make Ukraine happy," that isn't going to get anywhere. So what I said is that okay, there's a basis here. There are things here that clearly Russia could accept, but there are obviously the things there that Russia couldn't accept. And I made clear what Russia couldn't accept. Russia couldn't accept um, no limits on the size of Ukraine's military, and Russia couldn't accept the presence of NATO forces on Ukrainian territory as per security guarantees and building their military bases and missile sites and whatever. So that's why I said that would not be acceptable to Russia. But as I said then on Friday, and I said a moment ago, um, Russia obviously has to then decide how long they intend to go on fighting this war, and particularly in circumstances where Trump could indeed um, uh, escalate the level of American involvement, and therefore the war becomes ever more difficult and ever more heavy in casualties. So that that's really the question that the Russian leaders would have to evaluate. So that now we say Trump owns this war. I don't think Trump owns this war under his first term. I don't. I disagree with that. I think it was Obama's war. Obama. It doesn't matter whether Obama sent whether he sent sheets or pillowcases and all that. Obama owns this war in that Obama signed off on the coup in Maidan in 2014, and thus triggered the events that led to this war. The effective secession of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and then the use of force by Kiev to try to crush that secession, and that forced, of course, the Russians to intervene. This was all set in train by Obama. Trump's contribution to this was pretty well limited. Yes, he sent the Javelin missiles, which is more than Obama had sent, but I don't think that was it really wasn't his war. I mean, it was Obama's war, and then I think it was Biden's war. I think Trump contributed. I think the question by sending the javelins, it was a contribution, but that's a long way from saying that it's his war. He came into power saying he wanted to improve relations with Russia, and I think he did want to do that, but I think he was sidetracked by RussiaGate, which it's if you go back in time, RussiaGate came close to ending his presidency. I mean, there was the Mueller report. We didn't know which way that was going to go. Mueller could well have recommended prosecution of Trump. I think he obviously wanted to do that, recommend prosecution. That could have led to impeachment. So that was a serious threat to his presidency. And he went out of his way to appease his critics, to show how hard he could be on Russia. That doesn't mean that it's his war. It really isn't his war. It's Obama's war, because the crucial events took place under Obama, and then Biden massively escalated American involvement. The rootless liberal cosmopolitan. I don't get that one, but okay. I mean, I don't think I am that. Anyway, Marx then go on, says, I see that the dollar has dropped 9% since the estate agent came to power. Don't give me it's good for the exports, as America is a net importer, hence it's a terrible trade balance. Yeah, no, well, you see, if you boost exports, then that means your trade imbalance becomes better. And if your dollar declines, then imports become more expensive, and therefore that acts as a disincentive for people to buy goods from abroad. I mean, that's why countries devalue their currency, and the best example of that is, of course, China itself, which is a master of devaluing its currency. It has a very very low value of currency because it's a way of discouraging exports and, of course, of encouraging its exports. So South Korea has a 0.66 tariff on American imports, yet America has a 3.5% tariff on South Korea. Who is ripping who off? 20 million containers land in American ports in 2024, under which 40% from China, value around 450 billion, was sales in the American economy of 1.4 trillion. Again, who's ripping who off? Well, look, China is running a massive trade surplus with the United States. The United States does not want to continue with that arrangement. China runs a massive trade surplus with the European Union. The European Union doesn't want to continue with that. There are ways in which China has done this. I mean, all this, I've mentioned this before, all of the ways that China maintains these artificial trade surpluses. It suppresses demand at home, but it keeps wages low. It keeps welfare system to the barest minimum, which means that everybody has an incentive to save and therefore not to spend money. It manipulates its currency like by constantly devaluing it. It steals intellectual property. It does all kinds of things, and then of course there's all sorts of regulations which hamper imports. That's how China does it. This is a deliberate policy. Doesn't come about by accident. When a country runs consistently trade surpluses, that's because that's the policy it deliberately pursues. Now you can do that. I don't begrudge the Chinese doing that. I mean, they're doing what they think is to their advantage. What China cannot do, and what China's apologists cannot accept, is that other countries don't have to put up with it. There was always going to be a moment when the United States would get really fed up with this. When the United States is saying that, hey, we're getting deindustrialized, we're suffering deindustrialization because of these massive trade deficits. We've tried to address this problem nicely with China over the years, and China has done nothing about it. All the various promises that China has made, it hasn't done anything about it. Now we're going to try and resolve this by another method. So I've said this before and I'll say it again, which is that China doesn't have too many options. It can defy the United States, try to form this anti-American coalition, but as you can see, that has failed. China's attempt to create a united front with South Korea and Japan and Australia has failed. None of these countries are particular fans of China. China's goodwill tour of Southeast Asia failed. Again, they don't particularly want to get to be the site of Chinese goods being dumped in their markets. And the Europeans, Ursula von der Leyen and the rest of them have said, we're not going to be the dumping ground for Chinese products, which is the problem with countries that run massive trade surpluses and go out of their way to avoid demand for in their consumer markets. They deliberately try to minimize imports. Well, when you have a system like that, then that is not viable. It's not, this is written about by Adam Smith, and which is that it was very much written about by John Maynard Keynes at the time of the creation of the Bretton Woods Agreement, which is that you can't have policies, a world trading system in which one country is continually running a trade surplus, and another country is running a continued trade deficit. Because what then happens, this is in Keynes, this is something that preoccupied Keynes at Bretton Woods, is that capital moves from high wage countries to low wage countries, because essentially capitalists think the way, why don't I invest my money in a country where pay is low, environmental regulations are minimal, but I can make a lot of money. And that was the whole point. That was why they created this the Bretton Woods system, that countries with the trade balances would be um, self-sustaining. But when you have a system like this, where one country runs these massive trade surpluses with everybody, that's not sustainable, and that had to end. Anyway, Vic Shakapopoulos, always good to see you. George, I was unpleasantly surprised with your comment about the pro-Palestinian protests in the UK. Comparing them to the street fights between Muslims and Hindus is off the point. No, I mean, maybe I didn't express myself the way I intended. What I was saying was that if you bring in mass of immigrants, whether it's in the UK or France or Germany or anywhere else, you are going to bring in all of their political concerns, and they will play themselves out on the streets of the receiving countries. And that's separate from the rights and wrongs of the issue of Palestine. But nonetheless, when you have essentially you reach a critical mass of Muslim migrants and Hindu migrants and Sikhs and everyone, lo and behold, the streets of the United Kingdom become battlegrounds over issues that really have nothing to do with the concerns of the British people. I mean, when you go to another country and you enjoy and you receive their hospitality of another country, you kind of think, okay, well, you kind of expect to play by their rules, and at the very least, pretend to be interested in what they're interested in, and concern themselves with what they are concerned with. So for the British people, they think, well, hey, why are we seeing we got Hindus and Muslims fighting it out on the streets, and and then you go Muslims, massive protests over Palestine. Now, because that's a separate issue from the rights and wrongs of it. But without question, you're bringing in many people whose main concern is not at all anything to do with Britain, but is something else. Whether it's India, Pakistan, whether it's Kashmir, whether it's the treatment of Muslims in Bosnia, the treatment of Muslims in Russia. It's I think, well, what does any of this got to do with the British people? And I think that was always obvious, that when you allow this kind of massive migration, then suddenly, a country is transformed, and so people are fighting out over issues that are only of peripheral interest to the people who actually reside in their host countries. Anyway. And then Vic goes on, while I agree that it's senseless that the latter two groups are fighting their fights in the streets of England, there's absolutely no analogy between that and the fact that the people in the UK are protesting the Israeli pacification of Palestine. The obvious difference is the fact that the UK is heavily involved in helping Tel Aviv. Well, yes. I mean that is certainly an issue of the UK is involved in helping Tel Aviv. However, it's still basically once that's a legitimate protest, and the British government is involved in that. Um, but if you're living in Britain, um, this isn't really your main concern. If you're basically you're concerned with um, you know about your standard of life. You're concerned with the fact that housing is unaffordable. Yeah, you're concerned with the fact that of the massive deindustrialization that has occurred in the country. It's hard to persuade them this is the issue you need to be concerned with. Now, the people who show up of these protests, and one has to say that there's a um, I would agree that the protests that concern Israel and Palestine are are fairly cosmopolitan. It's by no means entirely Muslim. Um, but if that if the British people feel that if it does lead to violence, then they'll say, well, why is this such a big concern for us? There are plenty of other things in the world that they need to be concerned with. So that was really my only point, whether that once you bring in a critical mass from elsewhere, then many of these issues suddenly manifest themselves on the streets of a host country. This wasn't the case just a few years ago. Well, let's say like a few decades ago. Yeah, there were people who would protest about is the Intifada, that people would protest about Israel's invasion of Lebanon, but the massive protests that you get now, I do think that is connected with the mass migration into the UK. But as I say, I think this is you can take whatever view that you want about that. Um, it's still the case that there's a peculiarity of having these huge demonstrations um, in the United Kingdom about something that most people in Britain really don't care about. And then and then the issue of sort of Muslim protest is the case. You see it on all kinds of issues about with Muslim victimhood. Now, I think in the case of Palestine, the case is quite strong, but the Muslim victimhood in Kashmir, Muslim victimhood in Russia, Muslim victimhood, in in Egypt or whatever. That I think that is something that's emerged as a result of this the mass migration. Anyway. Vic says, I'm of course against transforming that fight into a primitive race war. It would be a bastardization of the noble Palestinian cause, making the anti-Israel protests in the West devolve into a tribal conflict like the Hindu-Muslim one is definitely the objective of the Zionists, so please don't help them in that. Yeah, but okay. That's I'm not helping anyone. I'm just pointing out that this has the fact that you have these massive protests in the United Kingdom and particularly in the United Kingdom is absolutely tied to the presence of a very substantial Muslim population. And you can say it's separate from other things, but it's not wholly separate. It's not wholly separate from the Muslim preoccupation with Kashmir, or Muslim preoccupation with Bosnia and Herzegovina, or Muslim preoccupation with Russia. But again, that's separate from. I can certainly separate from any sympathy one can have um, for the Palestinian cause. Anyway, Judy says, SCOTUS. Now, Judy Hotchkiss, always very good to see you. Thank you so much for your contribution, for your generosity. I really appreciate that. And Judy says, SCOTUS will hear arguments on May the 15th, a case concerning Trump's effort to end birthright citizenship. However, the justices will not be ruling on the constitutionality of the policy. Instead, they will consider whether lower court judges have overstepped by issuing nationwide injunctions. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Now, it's a shame, because I think they really ought to address the constitutionality of birthright citizenship, because any reading of the 14th Amendment, which says anyone born in the United States or subject to the jurisdiction thereof, you could say, well, given the historical circumstances, what they meant was that when that 14th Amendment was adopted, they specifically meant to include black Americans who had recently been freed as slaves. So in other words, yes, they were born in the United States, but they were subject to in other words, they were actually subject to the jurisdiction of the United States government. They obviously did not mean anybody who happens to reside in the United States at any particular moment. So, like a tourist who happens to be in the United States and gives birth, and therefore the product of that birth suddenly becomes a U.S. citizen. I mean, obviously, that's not what they meant. They meant that this was a reference to the newly freed slaves who were born in the United States and were subject to the jurisdiction of the government of the United States. Now, if you're in a country as a tourist, you aren't subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. You're subject to the jurisdiction of the government from which you came. And definitely, if you're illegally present in the United States, then you're not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, because the United States government doesn't even know that you're in the country. Because, of course, if it knew that you were in the country, then it would move to deport you. So if the government doesn't even know you slipped in illegally, it doesn't know that you're in the country. You can't be subject to its jurisdiction if they doesn't even know that you're there. So the courts just made silly rulings on this and convinced liberals that somehow that if you give birth, anyone who is born on the territory, whether you're a tourist, you're working here, or whether you slipped into the country legally, automatically you are a citizen of that country. No country in the world would accept such nonsense. And yet this has become a kind of the credo of liberals, and it obviously has to be addressed, by the United States government, because it's a system that is rife for abuse, and people do abuse it, and people come to the United States exactly for that purpose, to give birth in the United States so that the child can then claim U.S. citizenship. I mean, does anyone really believe that the drafters of the 14th Amendment intended that to happen, intended that people should come to the United States and with a view to giving birth here, so that they would have the child could have citizenship? So no, but you're right, and the Supreme Court is going to duck this issue. They shouldn't, because it's a very important issue. But this is the Roberts Court, the Roberts Amy Coney Barrett Court. Always wants to duck the important issues because it doesn't want to make itself unpopular. So they're not going to rule on it. But they absolutely should. Let's go back. Where are we? So I got another question here from Marx. Now, Marx, all right, let's see, where are we? Trump has a rating of 34%, the lowest in 80 years for the first 100 days. That's not true. That isn't true. If you look at the real clear polling average, he's a little bit under. He's about in the mid 40s. So that simply isn't true. That's 34%. He's not at 34%. No, Biden was at 34%. So that's simply untrue. What has Trump accomplished? No peace, no trade agreements, low growth, blah, blah, blah. Well, the thing is that everything takes a long time. He may well fail. I'm not saying I'm not carrying water for Trump. He may well fail, but you can't judge an administration by what happens in the 100 days. I mean, this whole 100 days thing is a fake. It started with FDR with his first 100 days, and then it's sort of become somehow established. Oh, this is some big deal. What a president does in his first 100 days. He's got 4 years. A presidential term is 4 years, so you've got 4 years to achieve something. And he may achieve something. He may not achieve anything. But he's got an ambitious agenda. And if you have an ambitious agenda, then it's going to take time to accomplish it, for the simple reason that if the more ambitious it is, the more resistance it will engender. And Trump has obviously engendered a great deal of resistance on his foreign policy, on his economic policy, on his immigration policy, on his policy to take on the elite universities. So that's clearly, a lot of people are going to be upset, and a lot of people are going to mount opposition to Trump. Clearly through the courts, but through elsewhere as well. So I wouldn't judge anything. I mean, as I say, it's not 34%, but the worst thing that you can do when you have an agenda is to go by the polls, because if the polls are going to tell you absolutely don't do that, don't do anything, just do easy popular things, have fun, so and be entertaining, and try and get a good coverage in the media. Keep the mainstream media happy, and then you'll be coasting in the polls. Well, Obama did that. Obama kept the mainstream media happy, and he got thumped. He got thumped in the 2010 midterms. He got thumped in the 2014 midterms. He did win re-election, but only because he was up against one of the worst candidates any political party had ever put up, namely Richie Rich, which was Mitt Romney. I mean, anybody can beat Mitt Romney. So you can do the try and do the popular thing, but Obama really accomplished very little, other than getting all sorts of terrible judges in place, and that I think will be the Obama legacy. The various judges that he's inserted throughout the system, who are going to be around for many years, because of course judges, being unelected and unremovable, they can stay there until they're 90 years old, and so they have a lot of influence. But I don't think it's any big deal at all. If you're unpopular, it's no big deal if the dollar goes down in value, and it's no big deal if the stock market plunges. Stock markets go up, stock markets go down. The dollar goes down, it would be the easiest thing in the world for the United States to raise the value of the dollar. I mean, that's easy. It's easy to do. You just, the Treasury can just start buying some Treasury bonds, and the value of the dollar goes up. So none of these things are really matters or real crises. So the worst thing I think anything president can do is to determine policy by how am I doing in the polls, because then I think you get the worst of all worlds. You'll be unpopular and you won't have accomplished anything, and the 4 years will have passed very quickly. Robert, always very good to see you. Thank you so much, Robert, as always, for your generosity. And then Robert says, well, the libertarian critique of all government intervention is dramatized by the first war on drugs, prohibition, which served to create gangs where virtually none existed. The production of gangs was greatly expanded under the second war on drugs, fueling violent cartels and mass incarceration. Government intervention never solved problems. Rather, the libertarians argue the problems are manufactured and managed as a strategy of control, turning citizens into a subject. Well, that's that's an interesting argument. Prohibition did have an effect, and it had some positive effects, which is that alcoholism went down, and all the negative consequences of alcoholism did go down. Now, I'm not defending prohibition, but it did have a positive effect. My view of drugs is that I don't see any positive effect at all on drugs, of drugs. I think these are really very deadly substances. They're destructive of human lives, destructive of families, and particularly when you have all sorts of other social problems, they only fuel and exacerbate any intrinsic problems that are already there. So I don't see any advantages in legalizing it. Also, there's the real problem of shifting the burden onto someone else. So they say, well, let's not criminalize it. Let's treat people if they have drug problems. Well, fine. I mean, that's okay. You don't want to criminalize. You want to treat people. That's fine. But it's still an expense that's borne by everybody else. And then that seems somewhat awkward to justify. Why should everyone else pay for something that is a habit that has no positive, no redeeming features to it? I mean, all the attempt to show that somehow, well, marijuana has some positive therapeutic features. Well, no doctor has ever been able to identify any positive therapeutic features to it. I mean, the best argument is always that, oh, well, if you legalize alcohol, well, why don't you legalize drugs? Okay, but that's not a very convincing argument. If you already have something that has negative effects, such as alcohol, I mean, it has also very positive effects, but has many, without question, many negative effects. Criminality, spousal abuse, destroyed lives. Why do you want to add to that burden? Why do you want to bring in other things? So I find it hard to see any great advantages in legalizing substances that are inherently dangerous. And of course, then you have also the question as to, well, if you are going to legalize this, then why not legalize everything? just whatever it is, everything, and prescription medication altogether. You pick up your heart medication over the counter, enjoy yourself with that. So enjoy yourself with everything. If you like oxycodone and the effect that that has on you, take that, and basically just completely indulge yourself. Whatever it is, get it. That's fine. But somebody's going to have to pay for that. I mean, somebody's going to have to pay for all of the terrible health effects of all of this. And I don't quite see the justification. And that's the problem I find with the libertarian argument. Somebody is always going to have to bear the costs. It's fine if you bear it yourself, but nobody ever does bear it. If you basically strung out on heroin, you don't bear the cost. Somebody else is going to have to pay for the cost of the treatment, the therapy, and the methadone and everything else. That's a huge burden that you're going to be imposing on everyone else. And why would they? Why should healthy people or people who have led lives that were intelligent enough to avoid addiction, why should they be forced, burdened with paying for others who have taken a lot of bad, foolish decisions? So that's why I'm not. I mean, I can see the libertarian argument, but I'm not persuaded by it. Vic says, "What political shows do you watch unironically?" I don't know. It was, in terms of which political shows that I watch a number of them. I can't say I enjoy too many of them, but I just watch them, and I get something out of them. Many times I find them very annoying, um, and just But the best of them, I think, are the ones on the gray zone. I think Max Blumenthal and Aaron Matt, they do a good show, and they don't annoy me in the way others shows. Like if I watch Viva Fry and Robert Barnes, it's hard for me to take. I get very annoyed very quickly. So I mean, if I say, well, what I think is what I would recommend, I'd say probably Max Blumenthal and Aaron Mate. I think they do a good show, but nothing else that I would particularly want to recommend. And then Judy says, apropos of the 34% rating, which, as I said, is not true. But Judy says, Rich Barris of Big Data Polling and the People's Pundit contends the accuracy of the current polls. He compares the accuracy of those same polling companies when they poll Trump's support before the election with Trump's actual vote on election day. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think the absolutely naive way in which people just tout these polls as if somehow these polling organizations have a sterling record of getting getting elections right and being able accurately to forecast election results is an absurdity. I mean, we've had election after election in which polls have been spectacularly off target. So it's amazing how people suddenly, oh well, if CBS and New York Times say this, then this must be an accurate picture of public support. Well, yeah, what were you saying during the elections? I mean, so yeah, so I think it's absolutely is ridiculous. But as I say, even that number 34% is wrong. And in fact, that Rasmussen also says, don't go by these polls. I mean, they're dubious methodology. Again and again and again, these polls always oversample Democrats. It's like they always more Democrats than there are actually within the public. Um, uh, um, Mark says Trump could have walked away within his first week in power against Ukraine, therefore he owns it. Um, no one can walk away in the first week of power. I mean, I think that's nobody ever does that. I mean, that you have to give people time. I mean, you can't just end the war within a few weeks, even a few months. Um, it's always this oversimplification. People very much used to say this about Nixon. Oh, Nixon could have just walked away. Nixon should have just walked away on January the 20th, 1969. Should have walked away from Vietnam. Well, who does that? Nobody does that. Great powers, states, they can't just walk away from a conflict in which the great states had been quite heavily involved. The United States has been heavily involved in Ukraine. It's not going to be able to walk away within 24 hours. I don't think at the moment he owns it, because at the moment he has been trying to act as a peacemaker. Whatever we can criticize that, whether it's been effective or not effective, but nonetheless he has attempted to bring the war to an end. Once that fails, if that fails, and he decides to throw in his lot with Ukraine, which could happen, then you can say now he owns this war. Now this war is his. At this stage, I think he deserves credit for trying to bring it to an end. So I don't think it's fair to say he owns this war. No, he doesn't own this war. He's trying to find. He's clearly making efforts to bring this war to an end. He's using Steve Witkoff as his go-between. He's trying to put together peace plans or whatever, but he's trying to bring it to an end. And I think that's commendable, and I think you should be, for the time being, given the benefit of the doubt. Judy says Trump can still easily walk away. He's threatening to do it. Even Marco Rubio is threatening to. Yeah, he can walk away. I don't know whether he will. I hope he does, because yes, there's absolutely time for him to do that. So and that's why, as I say, I think it's too early to say he owns this war. He will own this war only if he decides to stick with it and decide to go on supporting Zelensky, essentially continuing with the Biden policy. Then you could say, yeah, now he owns this war. It's his war. I don't think it's his war at this stage. Marty, always very good to see you. Good evening, George and Gagglers. Thank you, Marty. Very, very good to see you. NKMRD, good evening. Always good to see you. And then NKMRD says mass migration has really become a topic gradually over decades now. It was not that one big flood some proposed, I think. Well, it has been a big issue. I mean, it started off with, by the 1960s, it was already becoming an issue. And it was interesting that when Enoch Powell delivered his famous April 1968 Rivers of Blood speech, he understood the importance of this issue, because in a way he had been involved in bringing migrants into Great Britain. I mean, he had worked in the health ministry, and the health ministry, I think he had been a junior health minister. They were encouraging mass migration. At the time was from the Caribbean into the health system, bringing in nurses and so on. So he had really the first-hand view of what was really happening. That somehow the government was very happily bringing in people. People at the time, no one really noticed this. This is the 1950s. That suddenly the government is bringing in cheap labor into the United Kingdom. Then, of course, the migration began to get quite it began to get a lot more serious. Nothing like what it is now, but it was already getting more serious during the 1960s, and particularly from the Indian subcontinent, so India and Pakistan, through arranged marriages and so on. So basically, it was becoming a serious issue. So when he made his speech, which really catapulted the immigration issue, up until then, it had been an issue, but only at the street level. There had been riots in various cities, and particularly notoriously, there was the riot in Notting Hill, um, uh, and that was in 1961, 62. But when Enoch Powell raised this issue, that became a very big deal because he was a senior member of the Tory shadow cabinet, and that's and he warned about the consequences of mass migration, and boom, that he became a national figure, and immigration became the subject of debate. Not that anything much was done about it, and the migration has continued over the years, and so the number of immigrants in the United Kingdom far exceeds anything that was present in 1968 when he gave his speech. So it really is the biggest issue in Europe. It propelled Marine Le Pen. It's propelled Alternative for Deutschland. It propelled Geert Wilders' party. Um, it propelled Salvini in Italy, and now got Maloney. That doesn't mean that they've done much about it, but it's it's an issue that has to be addressed. But as in the United States, it's kind of hard to do um, because of the courts and because of the NGOs, and they can thwart any real attempt by politicians to do something about it. Anne Marie, always very good to see you. Thank you so much for your generosity, Anne Marie. Anne Marie is a resident uh, distinguished musician, an expert on music, and so her comments um, on music, particularly my selection for the Gaggle Music Club, are always really interesting and really worth reading. So I'm always looking forward to reading Anne Marie's comments. And particularly this week, I posted Alan Hovhaness, an American composer, not terribly well known, but I think a rather interesting composer. So I hope Anne Marie will write something about that. But thank you very much, Anne Marie. Marx says immigration is to weaken the nation, to be used against the native people. Immigrants are an industry for the liberal minority. I agree. I agree, absolutely. I think that's right. Anyway, NKMRD says, my general opinion is that people who do drug experiments should also care for the safety measures to some good degree. There can be some people ending up in a hospital or whatever, but not so many. In the olden days, there was a mentality that one should seek his borders and deal with that, only to get the first aid car if there's no other option. Changed a lot, but people get more soft, and so the choice of drugs, easygoing but pleasing drugs, are very popular mostly. I mean, the thing is that they obviously have, they are powerful, dangerous drugs. They are destructive of lives and families, and then somebody has to pick up the tab, and I think that's really the problem, and the problem of the libertarian argument, which is, well, okay, well, let's just legalize it, but given the consequences, then somebody has to pay for it, and they're quite. We already have a vastly overburdened healthcare system because somebody has to pay for all of the healthcare that is provided to people who are unable to afford the medical treatment. I mean, there's a lot of people get a lot of medical treatment that they don't have the means to pay for, and their insurance doesn't cover it, but nonetheless they still have to get it, because you can't just allow people to die on the street. You can't allow people just to die in the emergency room. So they get the health care, but somebody has to pay for it. So I find it hard to justify um, anything that actually makes life causes pain, sickness, and destructiveness, and somebody has to pay to remedy it. Adi says, I also have an Oktoberfest perspective, which sometimes really is abuse of hospitals. It's once a year. The city earns money, but maybe not the doctors. It's very extreme sometimes. Yeah. Okay. And then Anne-Marie says, I think everyone understands that mass immigration is a big problem, which has to be dealt with reasonably, and that it's certainly a very complex issue. But nonetheless, since the Western countries have and are doing it till today, colonized, exploited, and destroyed all these countries, whence many of these migrants are coming over, isn't it logic and actually just consequence that the West has to pay a price for what they actually brought on themselves? Well, I mean, that's certainly an argument. The problem is that the people who have to pay for it didn't have anything to do with Western imperialism. If you think Western imperialism, well, that came. It's colonialism. You can say this, neo-imperialism or whatever. But if Western colonialism came to an end in the 1960s, so the British gave up their empire in the 1960s. Germany gave up its empire forcibly during the First World War. France, Algeria, 62. Portugal was the last that gave it up in the 1970s. So the colonial empires have not been in existence for 60 or so years. Now the people, in impoverished cities, who have to live with the consequences of mass immigration, what do they have to do with empire? They didn't go and colonize everybody. They didn't rule over anyone in India. Again, the Indian Empire that came to an end in 1948. So that's almost 80 years ago. So it's hard to see how that you're going to punish people for something that happened many years ago, that came to an end many years ago, and punishing people who had nothing to do with it. There's people living in Oldham or in Leicester or in Sunderland or any of these deindustrialized kind of grim suburbs who have to live with the consequences of mass immigration. So you say, well, what did we do? We didn't colonize anybody. So then, I think that would be an argument. You can say that, which I think that I would accept, that you don't want to go around bombing countries, whether it's Syria or Iraq or whatever, and that can trigger mass immigration. And I think that's certainly true, and that's certainly an argument against bombing other countries. But the people who order this bombing, they don't have to live with the consequences of mass immigration. They tend to live in very nice areas, the most salubrious areas of the cities. They don't actually see the consequences of mass immigration. You're living in South Kensington, Knightsbridge, Chelsea, Westminster. You don't actually see mass immigration because there's obviously this is such an luxurious part of London that only the absolutely wealthiest people live there. So they have a nice enough life. It's somebody else who has to pay the price. The people who didn't actually make a decision to bomb anybody. They didn't cause any refugee flows. So that's why I think that there's, I think the wrong people are having to make the pay the price. Um, but but anyway, my my time I think is up. So thank you everybody who has joined me. Thank you for all of your questions and comments. Thank you above all to the people who have contributed to the tip jar, because I have to deal with those ferocious hounds tomorrow. I have to explain myself. Well, I did my best. Always very unimpressed whenever I make that argument. And so, but anyway, thank you so much. We will be back on Thursday at the same time. Hope to see you then. Thank you. Until then, good night. Goodbye. See you Thursday. Bye bye.